oh, just let me oh.
That clock keeps ticking like a metronome, and my thoughts keep telling me to get me home, but my balls keep telling me to let me oh, just let me oh.
The dive watch market is overly saturated today. There are simply too many of them to choose from. Whether you're looking at micro brands or to practically any of the large Swiss conglomerates, even to the Japanese segments of entry-level and high-end timepieces, dive watches have been integrated into every category for any price. But today we'll be looking at a watch that started it all. As always, if you would like any of your thoughts or watch suggestions spoken about by a designer, comment them below and I'll write them up. To begin, I'll get this out of the way first. I am a Rolex fanboy. Speaking purely as a designer now, and putting my opinions aside, they are tremendously good watches. Each model has a utilitarian design language, and more importantly, each watch has a distinct visual identity. There is a reason why so many people find their watches appealing, and it is not purely based on brand and hype. But today, it is common that many think that the Submariner was the first official dive watch to make headway. During the early 50s, the concept of being able to take a watch to depths was still more of a gimmick than anything practical for the public. So when the Submariner landed, marketing began pushing the watch's image everywhere, and looking back, they did a really good job. What Rolex failed to mention, and to this day keeps under tabs, is that they were supplying their movements to a little-known Italian watchmaker called Panerai, and their watches have been used by frogmen since the 1930s. The whole idea of the commercial dive watch was out in the open, and Rolex took the top spot. But only a few months prior, another watch beat the crown to market. And though it was much less successful than its competition at the time, it still is widely known today as the first commercial diver by enthusiasts. What makes the origins of the 50 Fathoms so fascinating is that the idea was the brainchild of the CEO at the time. He was a passionate recreational diver and primarily wanted to create a watch for himself. I find that so endearing. True passion and creativity. His goal was to create a watch that would be easy to read, robust, and also capable of withstanding great pressures and extreme conditions. Sounds easy, right? Bear in mind that this was a time when something like this hadn't been done before. There were no real patents to approve, no clear idea about how it would work, so the project was a shot in the dark. Because the idea was so new, our CEO was able to patent the double-sealed screw-down crown, the ubiquitous rotating bezel with easy-to-read markings, and the idea of the O-ring used to seal the casebacks tightly to keep the watch pressurized. This watch, therefore, is an excellent example of prototyping and development. Many mock-ups were made and tested, and after a while, and more rigorous testing, the watches all passed extremely well. And like any tool worth having, it was supplied to practically all Navy diving teams in the world. As the Submariner was making its rounds in advertising, looking pretty in shop windows, the 50 Fathoms was being used in combat. It was a watch that made it past the consumer and landed directly in the hands of people who relied on them. Now, after hearing this, you can see why these watches are so loved and appreciated. You can call the Blancpain 50 Fathoms an unsung hero. With the brief history of the watch out of the way, let's have a better look at the watch. Now you'll get to hear what a designer thinks about it. First, let's look at the original mil-spec piece. It is a phenomenal piece of design. Immediately what stands out to me are the proportions. Notice how large the bezel is in comparison to the dial. This is excellent. The most important element of the piece is glaring, making it easy to interact with. Then moving to the dial, it is extremely simple, almost too simple, with the usual layout of dots and battens that we have become so accustomed to seeing so much of today. Again, keep in mind that this was a design that had barely seen the light of day yet. And notice the very novel indicator at the base of the dial, used to detect if there had been a containment breach of water inside the watch. Another excellent piece of design for early adopters. And the element that stands out to me the most is how the diamond at the 12 on the dial and the bezel match up. I've always found it to be such a unique idea. But in my opinion, there are a few things that work better with the next model that we'll be seeing. The 50 Fathoms Aqualung, the more commercial version of the watch, looks very different. What else needs to be said about this model? That looks perfect. I cannot fault anything about it. This model is a classic example of how utility can be beautiful. What works for me is how the batons and the numerals work in tandem on both the dial and the bezel. This is very unique to the watch and looks so simple. And what makes me happy about the development of this watch into the modern era is that it stayed true to its original design language. Over the years, the watch saw incremental changes, but never lost sight of its original design ethos. And now looking at the modern iteration, there have been a few cosmetic changes. The watch looks more modern. The case has been shaped a bit better. The watch has crown guards. The dial now has sharper batons and a more interesting layout with raised and lowered portions. And the watch now has needle-shaped hands. But the essence of the watch is still there. And what I like most about it is that it is a Blancpain. It's not trying to imitate its competitors. It is just the way it is. That, in such a competitive marketplace today, is admirable. Going into more detail about the modern watch's specifics, we can tell that the brand still appreciates its heritage. Why? Well, most companies would remove the aluminium bezel insert and slap on a ceramic insert instead. It's hardy, it does the job. But to imitate the original Bakelite inserts, the 50 Fathoms goes the extra step to fit a bulbous sapphire crystal around the insert and also has full luminova on the markings. As we know, this is just not done by other brands. The dial still keeps all the original numerals and places the date complication between the 4 and the 5 marker. This makes the watch symmetrical and lets the date fade into the background when it is not necessary. All of these little, some would say meaningless elements show that the company has put a lot of thought into this watch. So what is my take on it? What could be improved? It is safe to say that the modern era of 50 Fathoms watches are not geared towards your average customer. It is a watch made for people in the know, and I think that is an awesome business model. If Mr. A walked into the bar, flexing a no-date Submariner, or even a Sea Dweller to everyone, only to come across Mr. B, who is sitting idly with a 50 Fathoms on his wrist, I think Mr. A might cower into a corner and spend the rest of the evening drinking alone. That was a joke. Nobody should judge you by your watch. But the point I'm trying to make is that this watch is so undercover cool. Nobody knows what it is, which is the best kind of cool there is. In saying that, I think what turns a lot of people away from the watch, including me, is the watch's size. The standard model measures to be 45 millimeters in diameter, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people when I say that it is too big for a good 70% of us who are interested in the watch. If the model could be tailored down to 40 millimeters for us mere mortals, I know that it would be an excellent seller. Now, of course, they do limited releases of the mil-spec pieces, and this watch is a perfect size. Maybe it was a test to see how people would react, and of course, most of the pieces were sold on the first day of launch. From a design point of view, there is nothing that stands out as wrong with this watch, which is strange to say because I'm usually the first to jump on the opportunity to redesign something. But this piece is just beautiful. Every element has been considered and executed, and in the end, the final product is unlike anything else on the market. As a designer who appreciates narrative and story, utility and function, this watch is true to its roots. It is utilitarian, it is luxury, and it is low-key. I might even venture far enough to say that this watch nears perfection. Now, many people might disagree on this point, and yes, there are other amazing dive watches out there, but none of them are like this one.